Now all the things being silent, her spirit could not rest. She appeared upon her mother, consult at her breast. For many months long or more, her mind was sore depressed. No more at night nor at day could she take any rest. Her mother's mind being sore disturbed, she dreamt a dream she saw. Her daughter she laid murdered beneath the red barn floor. She sent the father to the barn, where he the ground did thrust, and there he found his daughter, laying mingled with the dust.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
Somewhere along the line, true crime went from being a side interest to the thing that everyone talks about without blinking. A podcast hits in 2014, and suddenly people are planning tours around new episodes. By the early 2020s, friends are swapping details about cases from decades ago like they're trading recipes. You can be waiting for a coffee and hear someone explaining a case from 1982 with total confidence, like this is the most normal morning chat. Thousands of people tuned into the live broadcast of the O.J. Simpson trial. Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, all had flocks of women fawning over them. But our obsession with true crime started much longer than that. Between the mid-1500s and late 1600s, England basically went feral for true crime. Like, if you think we're obsessed now, these people were out here inventing the genre. Once folks started learning to read and printers figured out how to crank out cheap little booklets, suddenly everyone and their neighbor were passing around these tiny little pamphlets. They were short, messy, sensational little things, usually 6 to a couple dozen pages, and always about some absolutely unhinged murder, and people ate them up. But pamphlets were just the beginning. They also had these crime ballads, literal songs about the worst people in England, printed on giant sheets and stapled onto walls around town like medieval missing dog posters. And if that wasn't enough, trial write-ups were circulating too, giving everyday people the play-by-play of who said what in court. Basically, if someone committed a capital crime, the whole country knew about it before the body was even cold. The crimes people were obsessed with back then were basically the same ones that fill every true crime podcast queue today. We're talking messy domestic murders, sex-driven violence, women caught up in criminal chaos, and just a lot of blood. And because people have always been a little twisted, these pamphlets came with wood-cutout illustrations showing all the worst bits: dismemberment, torture, witchcraft, like a 1600 version of a clickbait thumbnail. But here's the kicker. Even though that content feels super for the masses weren't actually the ones reading this stuff. Literacy was growing, sure, but most working class folks didn't have the money, the time, or honestly the reading skills to sit down with a crime booklet after a 14-hour workday. According to historian Joe Wiltenberg, these dramatic little crime reports were actually considered pretty respectable reading material, mostly consumed by people in the artisan class and above. Basically, the middle-class girlies were the OG true crime girlies. And just like modern docudramas, these pamphlets were all over the place tonally. Some were pure shock value gore, others were like, here's your moral lesson for the day, painting the criminal as a cautionary tale who eventually gets smacked down by divine justice. And then there were the ones that tried to really dig into the criminal's life, especially when it came to fallen women, though even the sympathetic ones couldn't resist a little moral finger-wagging. Still, for all the drama, these stories did shine a light on how rough life was for the poor and the marginalized. The coolest part, though, unlike a courtroom where you have to land on a guilty or not guilty, these stories could sit in the gray areas. Some ballads were even written from the criminal's point of view, like Newgate Pentant or Last Goodnight songs. basically inviting readers to step into the mind of the person who did the bad thing. Wittenberg argues that people were way more interested in the criminal than the victim, and honestly, that hasn't changed much. These early narratives were already poking at the psychology behind the crime, trying to figure out why people do terrible things long before criminal psychology was even a phrase. Modern true crime audiences aren't all that different from the people who once crowded around those old murder pamphlets. A recent study from Boston University researcher Catherine Kaduku shows how deep the obsession runs today. True crime followers often get pulled into cases with a kind of gravitational force, scrolling endlessly, posting theories, forming emotional attachments to the people involved, and riding this strange mix of dread and fascination. The crime feels personal because it could be personal, and that imagined closeness keeps people locked in. Stories that unfold in familiar places only intensify that pull. When a case happens in a town that looks like yours and on a street that feels familiar, people start thinking that they understand the landscape, the clues, the type of person involved. And when a case explodes into national coverage, it becomes impossible to escape. Kadoku's study launched right as the University of Idaho murders were online everywhere, and many participants described feeling dragged into the story simply because it was unavoidable. Part of this comes from the overwhelming amount of information available online. People who spend a lot of time on social media often feel like they've earned a kind of unofficial training of internet investigation. Add in a long history of police missteps, hidden family dynamics, and overlooked evidence in past cases, and suddenly everyone believes that they might be the one to spot the detail everyone misses. Kadoku calls this forensic fandom, the idea that everyday people can become citizen investigators by piecing together what they've learned from previous stories. And honestly, that tracks if you look at the Netflix documentary Don't Fuck with Cats, it's all right there. There's also an emotional investment. Crime stories create uncertainty, and uncertainty demands resolution. When audiences form a parasocial bond with victims, suspects, or narrators, the need for answers becomes even stronger. And then there's the idea of the fear of missing out. After spending hours analyzing clues, the idea of stepping away and having the case break without you feels like missing the biggest moment of the entire story. Colleges have long argued that people choose media that meets specific emotional needs, and true crime checks several of those at once. Humans crave understanding and closure, and crime stories offer puzzles with real stakes. Learning about danger can create a sense of preparedness, almost like studying the playbook of what not to do. The emotional intensity of these stories can actually help people regulate their own feelings, because the fear and outrage become a part of a controlled arc. The social content is also powerful. Even one-sided relationships with the host or storytelling can feel grounded, especially when the story taps into shared fears. This strange mix of frightening and comforting mirrors real life, especially for women. Statistically, at a higher risk for certain violent crimes, many women use true crime as kind of a mental rehearsal. It isn't about catastrophizing, it's about preparation. Understanding danger becomes a way to feel more capable of navigating it. And beyond individual coping, true crime has grown into a social space. Online communities built around these stories give women room to share experiences, feel validated, and connect with others who understand the emotional weight of vulnerability and justice. In these spaces, true crime becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a way to process fear, build solidarity, and find a sense of collective healing. All of this explains why certain stories, no matter the century, grab hold of people and refuse to let go. When a case has that right mixture of mystery, emotion, and unsettling sense of, this could happen to someone like me, it becomes more than a crime story. It becomes a cultural fixation, and that's exactly what happened in one of the most infamous cases of 19th century England. A case that has every ingredient audiences crave. A young woman vanishes, a secret romance unravels, and a quiet rural town suddenly finds itself at the center of a national obsession. It's a story that would become known as the Red Barn murder, and it's captured public imagination long before true crime had an actual name. Maria Marten came into the world on July 24, 1801, the daughter of Thomas Marten, Polsted's resident mole catcher and part-time glove maker, thanks to the tiny pellets that he skinned for extra coin. Martens weren't destitute, but they were working-class rural Suffolk, small cottage, tight budget, and a life built around whatever the land gave them. After Maria's mother died, Thomas remarried a woman named Anne, who was only a handful of years older than Maria. Imagine that dynamic for a second. Your new stepmother is basically your peer, and you're all crammed into the same little household. Cozy is one word for it. Complicated is another. By her mid-20s, Maria was still living at home, which wasn't unusual for a woman with limited options and even fewer protections. She didn't have money of her own, and the social safety net for women like her was non-existent. It is said that Maria had once visited a fortune teller who told her that she would have several lovers and wouldn't live to an old age. It was one of those stories that floated around the village and in Polstead, where everyone kept track of who was spending time with who. Anything Maria did with anyone was noticed and discussed. In her early 20s, Maria started seeing Thomas Corder, the son of a well-off farmer. The relationship ended once she became pregnant. He walked away. Before the baby arrived, she was already with Peter Matthews. Not long after the birth, the child that she had with Thomas died. Now, Peter, he came from a comfortable background and was part of the land-owning families in Polstead. In fact, his sister was the landlady for the Corders. Very soon, Maria became pregnant again, this time with Peter's child. He didn't want the attention that came with having a child outside of marriage, and he didn't want to take on the responsibility. He did end the relationship, but he agreed to send support. He followed through and paid her £5 every quarter. Maria gave birth to a son that she named Thomas Henry Marten. Soon after the birth of her son, Maria began a relationship with William Corder. Yes, Thomas Corder's brother. William was born around 1803 and came from a middle-class tenant farming family in Polstead. By the time he and Maria had become involved, he was the head of his household. William had a reputation around the village. People knew him as someone who cut corners and caused trouble. At school, he was called Foxy because he stole, lied easily, manipulated people, slipped out of trouble, and acted shifty in both money matters and personal dealings. He once tried to sell his father's pigs without permission, and his father attempted to handle the situation privately, but William didn't change much after that. Later, he passed a forged check for £93 and got involved in another pig theft with Samuel Beauty Smith. When Beauty was questioned by the constable, he said about Foxy, quote, "I'll be damned if he will not be hung some of these days." After the first pig incident, William's father sent him to London with some money and instructions to find work. He didn't do anything useful with it and spent the money on his usual habits. William was called back to Polstead after his brother, Thomas Corder, died while trying to cross a frozen pond. Their father, John, had already died, leaving his wife with 6 children to manage the farm. Thomas's death was followed by the death of 2 more brothers, James and John, both who died from poor health. Within about 18 months, the family went from a full household of 4 sons to 1. And that left William and his mother, Anne Corder, responsible for running the 300-acre farm, with his sisters keeping the household going. William and Maria kept their relationship out of sight. Her parents weren't thrilled about it, and with William's history, plus the fact that his brother had already left her pregnant and on her own, they didn't exactly welcome him at the door. So the two of them met whenever they could in secret, and the spot that they used most was the Red Barn, a place that everyone in Polstead knew. Now, at this time in England, the barns were usually coated with red ochre wash, red-tinted tar, or red lead paint, and this one sat on the Corder farmland. The family used the barn for grains, tools, animals, and drying crops. After meeting there enough times, Maria realized she was pregnant again. This was her 3rd pregnancy out of wedlock, and William told her and her family that he would marry her. For Maria, this sounded like a real chance at stability. She was poor, she was raising a child on her own, and by the standards of the time, she had already taken hits to her reputation that made life harder for women in her position. A marriage offer from William looked like something that she could build a future on. William swept Maria off to give birth in a private location, as to not raise more suspicions on them and tarnish their reputations even further. Maria gave birth in 1827 at the age of 25. The baby died shortly after. Later, there are stories that claim the child may have been killed by either Maria or William, but nothing was ever proven. Even after the baby died, William kept telling Maria that he still planned to marry her. The relationship was rocky at this point. They argued constantly, and Maria suspected that he had taken some of the money Peter Matthew had sent for Thomas Henry, but William kept promising that the marriage was still the plan. After continuously putting off the marriage and proposal, he suddenly has a change in direction, and he tells Maria that they should run away to Ipswich and get married there. He said that he'd heard the parish office had a warrant out for her because of the illegitimate children. In truth, there was no warrant, but Maria didn't know that. What she did know was that she didn't have many chances left. A rushed marriage was better than no marriage at all, so she agreed. Originally, William said that they'd leave on Wednesday, May 16, 1827. Then he pushed it to the next night. Then he pushed it again. Finally, on Friday, May 18th, he showed up at the Marten cottage during the day and told Maria that they had to leave immediately because the constable was on his way with the warrant. Maria didn't want to walk out in broad daylight, but William insisted on a disguise that would keep her from being recognized. By most reports, William laid the entire plan out right in front of her stepmother, Anne. He had told Maria to dress like a man so that she wouldn't draw attention, and then he would take her things and meet her at the Red Barn. Once she got there, they could change her back into her own clothes and then head to Ipswich to start the marriage arrangements. Maria agreed. She dressed as he told her and went to meet him at the Red Barn. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. After Maria disappeared, William was seen hanging around in town still, despite the fact that he was supposed to be in Ipswich, eloping with Maria. He told the Martens that there had been a problem with the marriage certificate, but Maria had stayed behind in Ipswich while he came home to tie up loose ends. When they kept asking where she was and how she was doing, he said that he was afraid to bring her back because of the supposed warrant and the judgment that she'd face from the village from having a third illegitimate, out-of-wedlock pregnancy. He kept stretching that story until he ran out of excuses. At that point, he left Polstead for a few weeks. First, he went to London, then to the Isles of Wight. From there, he started writing letters to the Marten family with a brand new version of events. Now he claimed that he and Maria were in fact married and living on the island. Every time they asked why she hadn't written herself, he had a fresh excuse. She was unwell. She'd hurt her hand. Or the letters must have gotten lost. Meanwhile, the Martens are left trying to figure out how any of this made sense. Peter Matthew was still sending money for Thomas Henry, but if Maria was supposedly gone, why should he keep paying? And how were Thomas and Anne supposed to feed another child if that support stopped? While all this is happening, William was already moving on. He went back to London and immediately started building a new life. He placed an ad in the Times looking for a wife, yes, while claiming he already had one. And he received more than 100 replies. He also placed similar ads in the Morning Herald and the Sunday Times. He chose a school teacher named Mary Moore and married her in November of 1827. The two of them opened a girls' school like none of the chaos behind him had ever happened. Now, back in Polstead, stepmommy Anne has started to have dreams about Maria. In each one, Maria was dead and buried under the Red Barn. Anne could not shake the feeling that she needed to act on it, so she pushed her husband Tom to go out and look. Now, there is one theory that suggests that Anne, not much older than Maria herself, was also having an affair with William. She was in on the whole thing. But when she heard that he had gotten married to somebody else, she became jealous and wanted to get revenge. In fact, her vision started about 2 days after he married Moore. I mean, what better way in the early 1800s to leave people to a body without implementing yourself than with a prophetic dream? So on April 19th, 1828, Thomas goes out to the barn and he walks straight to one of the grain bins. The soil looks disturbed, so he took his mole-catching spike and pushed it down. It hit something soft. He digs with his hand until he uncovers a sack, and inside, there were the remains of his daughter. Maria had been gone for almost a year, and the body showed significant signs of decomposition. But there were details that made it clear who she was. Her hair was still there. Some of her clothing was recognizable. She had a missing tooth in life, and that same tooth was missing from the jawbone. She also had a small facial cyst that matched the corpse, and around her neck was a green handkerchief, the same one that she had worn the day she left to go meet William. Her injuries were obvious. She had a gunshot wound to the face and several stab wounds to the neck and cheek. An inquest took place at the Cock Inn in Polstead. Maria's sister Anne, also Anne, identified the body. The green handkerchief belonged to William, and that detail alone was enough to make the village turn its attention towards him as the suspect. The constable in Polstead, a guy named Eerie, had no trouble finding William. He got William's old address from a friend and followed the trail straight to Brentford. James Leah from the London police joined him, and the two of them made their way to Everley Grove House. William was running it as a boarding school for women with his new wife, Mary Moore. Leah walked in pretending that he wanted to place his daughter there, and he found William in the parlor at breakfast with 4 women, sitting in a dressing gown and timing his eggs with a watch on the table. Leah pulled him aside and tells him, "Hey, I'm here because Maria Marten is dead." William denies knowing anything about Maria. He's never met her, according to William, and he has no idea what happened to her. But a quick search of the house turns up a pair of pistols that he supposedly bought on the day that Maria died. They also found letters from a man named Gardner that looked like warnings about the discovery in Polstead. There was also a French passport tucked away as well, which made it look like he was getting ready to leave the country. William is taken to Bury St. Edmunds and is charged with 10 separate accounts of murder. Each account was based on a different possible way that Maria might have been killed. He was also charged with fraud. They wanted to nail him with anything they possibly could in case he got off on one of the other charges. In his first explanation, he said that Maria had taken his own life. If she had shot herself in the face, though, this does not explain the multiple stab wounds, although there are those who suggest that some of those wounds could have been caused by her father Thomas's mole spike when he was digging through the dirt. While all this is happening, the case exploded far beyond Polstead. Newspapers printed sensational stories about William. Publishers rushed out books, songs, and plays. People bought pottery decorated in scenes from the Red Barn. The barn itself was torn apart by souvenir hunters who wanted pieces of the wood for themselves, some part of the crime. By the time the trial began on the 17th of August in 1828, William had already been judged by the public. He even told Judge Alexander that he knew the entire county had made up its mind about him before he even stepped into the courtroom. He had requested a change of location for the trial, and that was denied. The date of the case had already been pushed back because the case had drawn so much attention. People were arriving in town as early as July 21st. Hotels filled up. Men bought tickets to sit inside the courtroom. Others waited outside to hear updates. One account said that the crowd was so dense that it took court officials half an hour to push their way through the streets just to get inside of the building and start the actual trial. The judge was William Alexander, and he was irritated with the way the newspapers had been covering the case. But the Times still praised the public for siding with William. When the trial opened, William entered a plea of not guilty. Once he was in front of a judge, he chose to represent himself. That did not help him. His defense was that Maria had taken her own life in the barn and he buried her afterwards, and that claim offended the court. Suicide was a capital offense in 1828, and anyone who died that way lost their property to the crown and was denied a proper burial. William stood there insisting this was what happened, even though he had spent months lying to her family about where she was and how she was doing. Maria's cause of death could not be determined. The science of the time couldn't sort out which injury came first or which one killed her. There was a wound in her eye that might have come from a sharp blade, similar to the one that William was known to keep on his person, but also it might have been caused by her father's spade when he uncovered her. The green handkerchief around her neck also raised the possibility of strangulation. The gunshot wound, another possibility. The indictment listed multiple possibilities. This is why William was charged with so many different charges of murder. It was to make sure that he wouldn't slip through on a technicality. Anne Marten testified about the day that Maria disappeared and about the dreams that had pushed her to send Thomas to the barn. Thomas told the court how he found the body. Maria's 10-year-old brother George said that he had seen William with a loaded pistol the day before Maria vanished, and later saw him walking from the barn carrying a pickaxe. James Leah described the arrest in Brentford and the items that were discovered in the house. All of this was laid before the jury. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who wanted Maria out of his life. They brought up the money that Peter Matthew had been sending for Thomas Henry and how William had been pocketing it. There was actually proof of this at the post office. They said that the situation between him and Maria had been tense for a long time. When it was William's turn to speak, he told the jury that he and Maria argued in the barn and he walked away. He said he heard a gunshot while he was leaving, ran back and found her dead with one of his pistols beside her. He asked the jury to give him the benefit of the doubt. The jury stepped out and came back 35 minutes later with a guilty verdict. Judge Alexander sentenced him to hang, and after that, his body would be taken for medical study. William would spend the next 3 days in his cell while people kept coming to talk to him. His wife visited. The chaplain came in and out. George Orridge, the governor of the prison, spoke with him as well. All of them wanted him to confess. William finally admitted that he killed Maria. He said that it happened when he accidentally shot her through the eye during an argument, and he insisted that he never stabbed her. William was hanged on August 11, 1828 in Bury St. Edmunds. People said that he looked weak and that he needed help standing. The crowd was enormous. Some papers claimed that 7,000 people were there. Others said it looked close to 20,000. When the rope was ready, John Orridge asked him if he had anything to say. William said that he was guilty and that his sentence was deserved. He died just before noon. His body, however, was left to hang for an hour. After that, the hangman, John Foxton, cut him down and kept William's trousers and stockings as part of his payment. The body was then taken back to Shire Hall. A long cut was made from the front of his torso so that people could see the muscle. The doors stayed open until 6 that evening. Thousands of people filed past to look at his corpse. The next day, the surgeons and medical students gathered for the dissection. A galvanic battery had been brought in from Cambridge. They attached it to William's limbs to make the muscles twitch. His chest was open, his organs were examined. There was talk about whether he had died from the drop or from the pressure on the spine. His skull was studied by phrenologists who claimed that they could read his character from the shapes and bumps on his head. His skeleton was then cleaned and reassembled. It was used for many years at the West Suffolk Hospital to teach medical students. Later, it was moved to the Hunterian Museum in London. There, it hung beside the skeleton of Jonathan Wild, who was an 18th century London crime boss who pretended to fight crime while secretly running the thieves that he caught. In 2004, after a request from relatives, the bones were taken down and finally cremated. But not everything stayed with the skeleton. A piece of his scalp, including an ear, was taken during the dissection and ended up on display. His skin was tanned and used to bind a book written about the actual murder itself, and another book covered in his skin was later found at Moser's Hall Museum. His death mask was made more than once, and copies are still kept at the Moser's Hall and Norwich Castle. The public's fascination did not fade after the execution. Instead, it grew. The hangman sold pieces of the rope that he used. People bought locks of Maria's hair. The Red Barn itself was torn apart by souvenirs hunters who wanted to take something home. Some of the wood was actually carved into toothpicks and sold to visitors. Maria's grave was chipped away at by people who wanted a piece of the story, and now all that remains is a sign hanging on a shed. Anything connected to either of them became something people felt they needed to own. The case turned into a market of objects, and the crowd treated every part of it like something they were entitled to collect. And of course, with most stories where a body is improperly handled, it didn't take long for people to start saying that William's spirit was not happy with the way his body was treated. One of the men who fed into that belief was Dr. John Kilner. He was a devout follower of the case and owned a surprising amount of Red Barn memorabilia. At some point, he ended up with William's skull. Some say he bought it, others say he stole it. Either way, trouble started as soon as he brought it home. Kilner said that it was at that moment he started having bad luck. He heard voices when he was alone. He thought he saw figures moving in the corners of the room. One night when he was in bed, he heard a loud noise downstairs. He went to look and found the cabinet where he kept the skull standing open. The box that held the skull was cracked, and the skull itself was on the other side of the room. Kilner was convinced that the spirit of William Cloder was angry and that the skull was cursed. He decided that the only way to stop the activity was to give the skull a proper burial. He paid for a Catholic service and had it laid to rest, believing that William finally had a place to settle and that the disturbance would end. Now, this story had everything people love to gossip about. It had a forbidden romance, a damsel in distress, a villain, ghosts. This case turned into its own little industry. Plays were being performed while William was still waiting trial. After the execution, someone rushed out a dramatic version of the story, and it sold well enough to help launch the Newgate novels that became bestsellers. Pennygraphs picked up too. They were these cheap plays in the back of rooms of pubs, and the Red Barn murder sat right beside the tales of Jack Sheppard and other criminals. James Catnach printed more than 1 million broadsides, these single-sheet papers that gave the public everything they wanted. They included William's confessions, the details of his execution, and a sentimental ballad that was said to be written by William. It was almost certainly written by Catnach or someone he hired, but that didn't matter to the people buying it. At least 5 ballads came out right after the execution. The excitement around the case meant that many different versions of the story were written and sold. Some were based on fact. Others were filled with dramatic additions. It makes it hard for modern readers to sort out what really happened. The trial records help, and the best account came from James Curtis, a journalist who spent time with William and then spent 2 weeks in Polstead talking to the people involved. He became so connected to the case that when a newspaper artist was asked to draw William, he accidentally drew Curtis instead. Polstead turned into a tourist destination. People traveled from all over, even Ireland, just to see the village where it happened. Curtis estimated that 200,000 people visited Polstead in 1828 alone. The Red Barn and the Martens' cottage drew the most attention. The barn was supposed to be demolished after the trial, but it was left standing. Eventually, it burned down in 1842. Flash forward to 1967. This writer named Donald McCormick decided he was going to shake up the Red Barn story. He put out a book called The Red Barn Mystery and tried to connect William Cloder to Thomas Griffith Wainwright. Wainwright was a real person. He was an artist and a writer who spent his life surrounded by rumors of poisoning people close to him. He was never convicted, but that suspicion followed him everywhere. McCormick claimed that William and Wainwright crossed paths when William was living in London. He also talked about this actress named Coraline Palmer. She performed in a melodrama based on the case, and according to McCormick, she convinced herself that William didn't kill Maria. He said that she believed a local gypsy woman committed the murder instead. And it sounds dramatic, but it kind of fits the stories people like to tell about these old crime cases. The problem with this theory is that none of it holds up. There's nothing that puts Wainwright anywhere near William, and there's nothing that places another woman at the barn. Maria's injuries point to a direct attack, and William confessed, even if he did try to soften those details. His behavior after the murder speaks for itself. The idea of a gypsy woman only shows up in McCormick's version in 1967. It was never brought up at all in the trial or by any witnesses. In fact, there's no sign that Caroline Palmer ever said anything like that. And you know what keeps circling in my head with this case? That dream Maria's stepmother had. And then there's the stories that came years later, like Kilner's story about the haunted skull. It reminds me of the Greenbrier Ghost from West Virginia in 1879. Zona Hestershoe died under suspicious circumstances, and her mother said Zona came to her at night and described what happened. The story spread fast enough that authorities dug up her body. The autopsy showed that her neck had in fact been broken, like her ghost said, and her husband was arrested. By the way, if you are interested in this case, I did do an earlier episode on this. So when you look at the Red Barn story, it makes sense that people keep circling back to the dream and the haunting stories. The case already had so much going on, and people were drawn to every part of it. Plays, ballads, souvenirs, theories, even that wild 1967 claim from Donald McCormick. And that's the part that feels familiar. The way people latch on to a case and keep turning it over. The way a story keeps pulling people in even years later. True crime didn't start with podcasts. It started with stories like this one, where people couldn't stop talking about it. This is Down the Crooked Path with Amanda Joy. Thanks for traveling with me. Until next week, keep your flashlights close and follow whatever mystery calls your name.